In February of 1637, a man named Wouter Winkel stood in a crowded tavern in Haarlem, holding a single tulip bulb in his trembling hands. This bulb, no larger than an onion, had just been valued at more than the price of a luxury canal house in Amsterdam. It was worth more than a fully loaded merchant ship returning from the East Indies. More than a master craftsman would earn in an entire lifetime of labor. Wouter had sold everything he owned to acquire this single bulb. His house on the canal. His furniture, crafted by the finest woodworkers in the province. His wife's jewelry, passed down through 3 generations. His children's inheritance, carefully saved over decades. Everything he had worked for, everything his family had built, reduced to this one fragile piece of organic matter sitting in his sweating palm. And within 72 hours, this bulb would be worth less than a common onion at the morning market. Wouter Winkel would lose everything. He would become one of thousands who fell victim to the first recorded speculative bubble in human history, a catastrophe so complete that it would echo through the centuries as a warning to all who came after. But here is what they never taught you in school, what the history books conveniently leave out, what economists still argue about to this very day: the Dutch tulip mania was not just about flowers. It was never about flowers. It was about human psychology stripped bare. About greed unleashed from all restraint. About the terrifying, breathtaking speed at which wealth can evaporate when an entire society loses its grip on reality. And the patterns that destroyed the Dutch Empire in 1637, the exact psychological and economic patterns that turned merchants into paupers and transformed the wealthiest nation on earth into a cautionary tale, those patterns are playing out in markets around the world right now, at this very moment, as you watch this video. The question is not whether history will repeat itself. History always repeats itself. The question is whether you will recognize the warning signs before it is too late. Whether you will be the one who sees the cliff before the stampede carries you over the edge. To understand how a flower brought the mightiest commercial empire on earth to its knees, we must first travel back to the origins of Dutch power itself, to understand what made this tiny nation so remarkable and so vulnerable. In the late 16th century, the Netherlands was an unlikely candidate for global dominance. A small, waterlogged nation of barely 2 million people, constantly fighting against the sea itself just to maintain dry land. The Dutch spent more time and treasure building dikes and pumping water than most nations spent on their armies. They had no gold mines like Spain. No vast agricultural territories like France. No natural resources to speak of, no timber forests, no iron deposits, nothing that should have made them powerful. What they did have was something far more valuable than gold or iron or timber: an obsession with trade and an understanding of capital that no other nation had yet mastered. The Dutch had essentially invented modern capitalism. The Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials VOC, established in 1602, was the first publicly traded company in human history. For the first time ever, ordinary citizens could buy shares in a commercial enterprise, sharing in its risks and its rewards. They created the first stock exchange in Amsterdam, where those shares could be bought and sold in an organized marketplace. They established the first central bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, which standardized currency and provided stable financial infrastructure. They pioneered insurance, creating the first maritime insurance markets to protect against the losses that inevitably came with global trade. They developed commodity trading, futures contracts, and financial instruments so sophisticated that they would not become common in the rest of Europe for another 200 years. Amsterdam became the financial capital of the world, a city where money flowed like water through the canals that crisscrossed its streets, where a merchant could raise capital for a voyage to the other side of the planet in a single afternoon. Dutch merchants controlled the spice trade from Asia, bringing pepper and nutmeg and cinnamon from distant islands that most Europeans could not find on a map. Dutch ships, the famous flight cargo vessels, dominated the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, carrying more goods more efficiently than any competitor. Dutch bankers financed the ambitions of kings and emperors across Europe, lending money to monarchs who desperately needed cash for their wars and their palaces. By the early 1600s, the Netherlands had achieved something unprecedented in human history: a small nation of traders and sailors and craftsmen had built a commercial empire that rivaled, and in many ways exceeded, the territorial empires of Spain, Portugal, and England combined. They called it the Dutch Golden Age, and the name was not an exaggeration. But with this unprecedented wealth came unprecedented excess. The Dutch had more money than they knew what to do with. The merchant class had grown so fabulously wealthy that they needed new ways to display their prosperity, new status symbols to separate themselves from the common people, new possessions to announce their success to the world. They built magnificent canal houses with ornate facades, each one more elaborate than the last. They commissioned paintings from masters like Rembrandt and Vermeer and Frans Hals, creating the greatest flowering of artistic achievement Northern Europe had ever seen. They imported luxury goods from every corner of the globe, silk from China, porcelain from Japan, coffee from Arabia, chocolate from the Americas. And then, from the distant mountains of the Ottoman Empire, carried along the trade routes that connected east and west, came the tulip. The tulip had arrived in Europe in the mid-1500s, brought by diplomatic envoys from the court of Suleiman the Magnificent, the great Ottoman Sultan who ruled from Istanbul. To European eyes, the flower was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its petals formed perfect geometric patterns, precise and mathematical, as if designed by an architect rather than grown from soil. Its colors ranged from pure snow white to deep blood crimson to exotic striped varieties that seemed almost supernatural in their beauty, as if painted by an invisible hand. The Ottoman sultans had long prized tulips, cultivating them in elaborate palace gardens for generations, featuring them prominently in art and architecture and poetry. The very word tulip comes from the Persian word for turban, reflecting the flower's elegant, wrapped shape. When the flower reached Europe, it immediately captivated the aristocracy. Here was something rare, something beautiful, something that could not be manufactured in a workshop or replicated by craftsmen. Here was the perfect status symbol for a society that measured everything in terms of rarity and price. The first tulips in the Netherlands were grown by botanists and wealthy collectors as scientific curiosities, objects of study rather than speculation. Carolus Clusius, the director of the botanical garden at Leiden University, cultivated some of the earliest Dutch tulips and jealously guarded his collection, understanding their scientific and aesthetic value. But he could not prevent theft, and soon bulbs began spreading across the country, passing from garden to garden, from collector to collector. By the early 1620s, tulips had become fashionable among the Dutch elite. A wealthy merchant might spend several hundred guilders on a particularly fine bulb to display in his garden, impressing visitors with his refined taste and substantial means, demonstrating that he had both the wealth to afford such luxuries and the cultivation to appreciate them. What happened next was something no one could have predicted, something that transformed a luxury hobby into a national obsession, something that would eventually bring the entire system crashing down. Around 1634, the tulip market began to transform into something entirely different from what it had been before. The catalyst was a peculiar botanical phenomenon that no one at the time understood. Certain tulips developed stunning flame-like patterns on their petals, intricate streaks of contrasting colors that made each flower absolutely unique. These were the broken tulips, and they were considered infinitely more valuable than their solid-colored counterparts. A solid red tulip was beautiful. A red tulip streaked with white flames was transcendent, irreplaceable, a work of art that nature had produced only once and might never produce again. What no one knew at the time, what scientists would not discover for another 3 centuries, was that these patterns were caused by a virus, the tulip-breaking virus, transmitted by common garden aphids. This meant that broken tulips could not be reliably reproduced. A breeder might cultivate thousands of bulbs, tend them for years with the utmost care, and never produce a single specimen with the desired flame coloration. Or a common bulb might suddenly break into patterns of extraordinary beauty, transforming overnight from worthless to priceless. This unpredictability created artificial scarcity of the most maddening kind. Unlike gold or silver, which could be mined in predictable quantities, unlike crafted goods, which could be manufactured to meet demand, the most valuable tulips were produced by random chance, by biological lottery. An artificial scarcity, combined with high demand and unlimited money chasing limited supply, created the perfect conditions for speculation. The first speculators were merchants and craftsmen who recognized an opportunity when they saw one. These were men who understood trade, who understood markets, who understood that any asset which reliably increased in price could be bought and sold for profit. Tulip bulbs could only be safely transplanted during a few months of the year, from June to September, when they were dormant. The rest of the year, they remained in the ground, growing roots and preparing to bloom, essentially inaccessible to trade. But this limitation did not stop people from trading them. Instead, buyers and sellers began exchanging paper contracts, written promises to deliver specific bulbs at future dates when those bulbs could safely be moved. These were essentially futures contracts, sophisticated financial instruments that allowed tulips to be traded year-round, even when the bulbs themselves remained buried in the earth. The tulip trade had become abstracted from the flowers themselves. People were no longer buying tulips. They were buying pieces of paper that represented tulips. And those pieces of paper could change hands dozens of times, passing from speculator to speculator, increasing in price with each transaction, before a single bulb was ever delivered to its final owner. This was the moment when speculation truly took hold, when the tulip trade transformed from a market for luxury goods into something approaching a casino. Throughout 1635 and 1636, tulip prices began their inexorable, seemingly unstoppable climb. A bulb that sold for 100 guilders in January might fetch 500 by June and 1,000 by December. The prices rose and rose, month after month, with barely a pause or correction. Traders who had bought early and held their contracts saw their paper wealth multiply exponentially. A man who had invested 100 guilders in tulips might find himself worth 1,000 guilders by year's end, then 5,000, then 10,000. Word spread through Dutch society like wildfire carried by the wind. Farmers heard about craftsmen who had made fortunes without ever touching a plow. Craftsmen heard about common laborers who had become rich overnight, richer than the master craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their skills. The stories grew more extravagant with each telling, taking on the quality of legend, of fairy tale. A chimney sweep who had invested his meager life savings in tulips and was now richer than the merchants whose chimneys he had once cleaned. A weaver who had traded a single bulb for an entire brewery and was now living like a lord, never touching a loom again. A farmer who had discovered a rare broken tulip growing wild in his field and had sold it for more money than his family had earned in 5 generations. Whether these stories were entirely true mattered far less than whether people believed them. And they believed. Oh, how they believed. By the autumn of 1636, the tulip mania had consumed Dutch society from top to bottom. Trading moved from the formal offices of professional merchants to the back rooms of taverns, which became known as colleges, informal trading houses where anyone with ambition could participate in the tulip market. Here, in the candlelit back rooms of drinking establishments throughout the Netherlands, anyone could become a tulip trader. No capital was required up front. No experience necessary. A buyer would simply sign a contract promising to pay for a bulb at a future date, and that contract could immediately be sold to another buyer for a profit, without a single guilder ever changing hands. The potential gains were unlimited. The risks seemed non-existent. After all, prices only went up. Everyone knew that. Everyone could see it with their own eyes. The tulip trade had become entirely divorced from both the flowers themselves and from any underlying economic reality. People were trading pure speculation, pure hope, pure faith that prices would continue to rise indefinitely. The prices reached during the peak of the mania seem almost unbelievable when viewed from our modern perspective, yet the historical records are clear and consistent across multiple sources. A single Semper Augustus bulb, considered the most beautiful of all broken tulips with its milk-white petals streaked with blood-crimson flames, sold for 10,000 guilders at the height of the market. To put this astronomical sum in perspective, consider what 10,000 guilders meant in 1637. A skilled craftsman, a master carpenter or blacksmith or weaver, earned approximately 300 guilders per year. A modest but respectable house in Amsterdam, the kind of house where a prosperous merchant might raise his family, cost around 500 guilders. A single tulip bulb was worth more than 30 years of skilled wages. More than 20 houses. More than most people would earn in their entire lives. The records from the period show extraordinary transactions that beggar belief. One viceroy bulb, not even the most valuable variety, was traded for a collection of goods including 2 lasts of wheat, 4 lasts of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat swine, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed with linens, a suit of fine clothes, and a silver drinking cup. The total value was estimated at 2,500 guilders. All of this for a flower bulb that would bloom for perhaps 2 weeks and then begin its slow death back into the earth, leaving nothing behind but another bulb that might or might not produce flowers of equal beauty. The psychology of the mania reveals something profound and disturbing about human nature, something that remains true across centuries and cultures. As prices rose higher and higher, a peculiar logic took hold of the Dutch mind. Buyers no longer asked whether tulips were worth their stated prices. That question had become irrelevant, almost quaint. Instead, they asked only one question: would prices be higher tomorrow than they were today? If the answer was yes, and the answer always seemed to be yes, then buying at any price was perfectly rational. This is the essential logic of all speculative bubbles throughout history. Value becomes meaningless. Only trajectory matters. Only direction. Only momentum. Are prices going up? Then buy. It does not matter what the asset is. It does not matter what it is worth in any fundamental sense. All that matters is whether you can sell it tomorrow for more than you paid today. And for 18 intoxicating months, the trajectory was always up. Fortunes were made overnight. Dreams were realized that had once seemed impossible. The normal rules of economic life had been suspended. A common laborer could become wealthy beyond imagination simply by buying a piece of paper and waiting for its value to increase. Of course, this meant that someone, somewhere, at some point, would eventually be left holding that piece of paper when the music stopped, when prices finally stopped rising, when the bubble finally burst. But no one believed they would be that person. Everyone believed they were smart enough, quick enough, well-informed enough to get out before the crash. Everyone believed they could time the market perfectly, selling at the top and leaving some greater fool to absorb the losses. The colleges that sprang up in taverns throughout the Netherlands developed their own elaborate rituals and customs, their own culture and hierarchy. When a sale was made, the buyer would pay wine money, a small gratuity to seal the deal and lubricate the transaction. Participants would gather around long wooden tables, smoking clay pipes and drinking Dutch gin, trading contracts back and forth in a carnival atmosphere of excitement and possibility. There were rules governing disputes, procedures for settling accounts, hierarchies of status based on trading prowess and accumulated winnings. An entire subculture had emerged around the tulip trade, with its own specialized language, its own legendary transactions, its own heroes who had made fabulous fortunes and its own villains who had cheated or defaulted. Some traders became genuine celebrities, known throughout their towns and provinces for their successful speculations, pointed out on the street as men who had beaten the market and accumulated wealth that their grandfathers could never have imagined. Others became cautionary tales, remembered for the fortunes they had made and subsequently lost, for the hubris that had brought them low. What is truly remarkable about the tulip mania is how quickly it normalized behavior that would have seemed utterly irrational just 2 or 3 years earlier. Transactions that would have marked a man as a lunatic in 1634 were commonplace by 1636. Families mortgaged their houses to buy bulbs, gambling their security on continued price increases. Craftsmen abandoned profitable trades they had spent years learning, neglecting their work to speculate full-time in the tulip colleges. Everyone had a tulip story, a personal tale of profit or loss, of opportunity seized or tragically missed. The language of the street had changed to accommodate this new obsession. People spoke of tulip varieties the way they might speak of famous personalities, with admiration or contempt or naked envy. The Semper Augustus, the Viceroy, the Admiral van Enkhuizen, the General Bull, these were not just flowers anymore. They had become symbols of infinite possibility, of personal transformation, of a world where the old rules of patient work and gradual accumulation no longer applied. But even as the mania reached its delirious peak, there were those who saw the danger clearly and spoke out against the madness. Pamphlets began circulating throughout the Netherlands that warned of inevitable collapse, comparing the tulip traders to the builders of castles in the air, to men who had mistaken fantasy for reality. Writers and moralists decried the speculation as a form of collective insanity, as a fever that had infected the national body. Clergymen thundered from their pulpits about the sin of greed and the vanity of placing faith in earthly treasures that could perish overnight. The governing authorities, initially tolerant of the trade as a harmless if somewhat vulgar pursuit, grew increasingly concerned about the social disruption it was causing, about fights breaking out over disputed contracts, about families being ruined by foolish speculation. But all these voices of warning were drowned out by the noise of commerce, by the intoxicating sound of money changing hands, by the excitement of a market that only went up. When you are watching your neighbors grow rich, when you are watching your own paper wealth double and triple and quadruple, warnings of doom seem less like wisdom and more like jealousy. Those who stood aside from the mania were not praised for their prudence. They were pitted for their cowardice, mocked for their failure to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. The end, when it came, arrived with shocking speed, like a man falling off a cliff he had not known was there. The traditional account places the collapse on February 3, 1637, at a routine auction in the town of Haarlem. The auction was for a collection of tulip bulbs being sold to settle an estate, a common enough occurrence that attracted the usual crowd of buyers and speculators. Bids were solicited. Contracts were prepared. And then something unprecedented happened, something that no one present had ever witnessed before. No one would buy. Not at the listed prices. Not at substantially reduced prices. Not at any price whatsoever. The buyers simply stood in silence, their hands at their sides, refusing to raise them in bid. The auctioneer lowered prices again and again, his voice growing desperate, and still no one would buy. The auction collapsed completely without a single sale being completed, the bulbs left unsold on the table. Word of what had happened spread instantly to other towns throughout the Netherlands. The failure of the Haarlem auction was not an isolated incident, it was a signal, a revelation of what everyone had secretly known but refused to acknowledge. Within days, the entire tulip market had simply stopped functioning. Prices that had seemed eternal evaporated literally overnight. Bulbs that had been worth thousands of guilders on Monday were virtually worthless by Friday. The tulip contracts that had made men rich on paper were suddenly worth less than the paper they were written on. The dream had ended. The music had stopped. And thousands of people were left holding promises to pay enormous sums for bulbs that no one wanted anymore. The aftermath was absolute chaos. Thousands upon thousands of contracts remained outstanding, legal promises to pay enormous sums for bulbs that were now worth mere fractions of their purchase prices. Buyers who had signed contracts at the peak of the market now refused to honor their commitments, arguing that the contracts were void, that they had been defrauded, that no reasonable person could be expected to pay such absurd prices. Sellers who had counted on those contracts for their livelihood demanded payment in full, threatening legal action, threatening violence. The courts were flooded with lawsuits so numerous that the legal system simply could not process them all. The guilds and town councils struggled to adjudicate disputes that had no clear resolution, that pitted neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend, family member against family member. Eventually, the Dutch government was forced to intervene, declaring that tulip contracts signed after November 1636 could be voided by payment of just 3.5% of the agreed price. This provided some relief to buyers but devastated sellers who received only pennies for bulbs they had expected to sell for fortunes. The losses were incalculable, beyond any accounting. Entire fortunes that had been built over generations vanished in an instant. Families that had been prosperous were reduced to poverty. Suicides were reported in multiple cities, though the records from the period are incomplete and the true death toll may never be known. The mood of the entire nation shifted with whiplash speed from euphoria to despair, from infinite possibility to bitter recrimination, from dreams of wealth to nightmares of loss. The story of the Dutch tulip mania is ultimately a story about human nature pushed to its extremes. About how quickly normal, sensible people can be swept up in collective delusions. About how easily greed overrides prudence when everyone around you seems to be getting rich. About how certainty can transform into doubt in an instant, how markets that seemed invincible can collapse without warning. About how the systems we build, for all their apparent rationality, are ultimately driven by the irrational hopes and fears of the humans who compose them. The Dutch did not lose their empire solely because of tulips. The decline of Dutch power had complex causes that extended far beyond the flower trade. But the tulip mania exposed something rotten at the heart of Dutch prosperity, something fragile beneath the glittering surface. It demonstrated the danger of building wealth on speculation rather than production, of mistaking rising prices for genuine value creation, of believing that trees could grow to the sky and that what goes up need never come down. As you reflect on this story from nearly 4 centuries ago, consider how it applies to our own moment in history. Consider the assets in our modern world that have soared in value based on speculation rather than any fundamental worth. Consider the collective certainties that everyone in our society shares without question, the assumptions about what will always increase in value, what is too big to fail, what represents the future that cannot be stopped. Consider your own investments, your own beliefs about value, your own assumptions about what will continue rising forever. The Dutch merchants and craftsmen who bought tulips at the peak of the mania were not stupid people. They were not uniquely greedy or uniquely foolish. They were ordinary people, perhaps people very much like you and me, caught up in extraordinary circumstances, making decisions that seemed entirely rational given the information available to them. They looked around and saw everyone else buying tulips. They heard the stories of neighbors who had made fortunes. They calculated the odds and concluded that the smart move was to participate. They were wrong. But they could not have known they were wrong until it was too late. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes with an almost musical precision. The specific circumstances of February 1637 will never recur exactly as they did. But the pattern, the deep human pattern of boom and bust, of euphoria and despair, of certainty and collapse, that pattern is eternal. It is encoded in our DNA, built into the very architecture of our minds, into the way our brains process risk and reward. The question is not whether bubbles will form in our future. They will. They always have and always will, as long as humans trade with one another. The question is whether you will recognize them for what they are when you are inside them. Whether you will have the wisdom and the courage to step back when everyone else is rushing forward. Whether you will remember the lesson of the tulip when the next mania takes hold of society. The taverns of 17th century Haarlem are long gone now, replaced by modern buildings that bear no trace of the madness that once occurred within them. The men who traded fortunes in tulip contracts have been dust for nearly 4 centuries. But their story lives on as a warning that echoes across time, speaking to us as clearly today as it spoke to their children and grandchildren. If this journey through history has opened your eyes to something important, if it has made you think differently about value and speculation and the frightening fragility of wealth, then carry that awareness forward into your own life. Share your thoughts below about what modern parallels you see to the tulip mania. What assets today might be tomorrow's worthless bulbs? What collective certainties might prove to be collective delusions? I am genuinely curious to hear your perspective. And if stories like this one help you see the world more clearly, help you understand the patterns that shape our economic lives, then continue this journey of discovery with us. Because understanding the past, truly understanding it in your bones, is the only protection any of us have against repeating its most painful mistakes.